Welcome to Soft Spoken Mysteries. Tonight is Strange Fridays, where we explore the most bizarre, shocking, and almost unbelievable corners of history's darkest chapters. I'm here to take you through two stories so strange, so extreme, that they almost seem impossible, but every detail you're about to hear is documented, verified, and absolutely real. In our first story tonight, we dive into the twisted world of Roman justice. For centuries, the Romans perfected the art of punishment, not just execution, but symbolic theatrical displays of suffering designed to terrorize and control. They would sew people into leather sacks with venomous snakes and wild animals, then drown them. They would force condemned men to fight unarmed, while wild beasts tore them apart for public entertainment. They would nail thousands to crosses along major roads as warnings to anyone who dared rebel. Then in our second story, we'll explore an obsession that drove ancient people to poison themselves slowly, deliberately, all in the name of beauty. They rubbed lead onto their faces until their skin rotted. They consumed arsenic to achieve pale complexions. They bathed in crocodile dung. They bought vials of gladiator sweat to use as face cream. The pursuit of beauty became a slow march toward death. And they knew it, but they did it anyway. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin our journey into history's strangest and darkest practices. Topic 1. Roman punishment, the empire of suffering. Picture Rome at the height of its power, the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Roads stretching across continents, aqueducts bringing fresh water to millions, philosophy, art, engineering, marvels that still stand today. But underneath all that civilization was something else, something dark. A system of punishment so brutal, so calculated, so theatrical, that even hardened soldiers would look away. The Romans didn't just punish crime, they made suffering into public spectacle. They turned death into entertainment. They created methods of execution so specific, so symbolic, that the manner of your death told everyone exactly what you had done wrong. Tonight we're going to explore those punishments, the ones that make modern people uncomfortable just hearing about them, the ones that reveal how a civilization could be both incredibly advanced and shockingly cruel at the same time. Let's start with perhaps the most notorious Roman execution, crucifixion. You probably already know about crucifixion. It's famous because of its religious significance. But what you might not know is how the Romans perfected it over 500 years of use. They turned it into an exact science of prolonged suffering. Crucifixion wasn't reserved for everyone. Roman citizens were typically exempt. This was a punishment for slaves, for rebels, for people the Romans considered beneath them. The class system determined how you died. If you were important enough, you got a quick beheading. If you weren't, you got the cross. The process began with scourging, flogging with a special whip called a flagrum. This wasn't a simple whipping. The flagrum had multiple leather cords, and at the end of each cord were pieces of metal or bone. Every strike would tear flesh. Many people didn't survive this preliminary beating. If you survived the scourging, you were forced to carry the wooden crossbeam to your execution site. This beam, called a patibulum, could weigh between 75 and 125 pounds. Remember, you've just been beaten nearly to death. Your back is raw meat. And now you're carrying heavy wood through the streets while crowds watch. At the execution site, you were nailed to the cross. Not through your palms, as many paintings show, through your wrists between the bones. The nails had to support your full body weight. Your feet were nailed too, usually to the sides of the vertical post. And then you hung there. The actual cause of death varied. Sometimes it was blood loss from the wounds, sometimes shock, but most often it was asphyxiation. The position of your body on the cross made it difficult to breathe properly. You could only take shallow breaths. To take a deeper breath, you had to push up on your nailed feet, scraping your raw back against rough wood. Eventually, exhaustion won. You couldn't push up anymore. You suffocated slowly. This could take hours, sometimes days. Roman guards would stay at execution sites until everyone was dead. If they needed to speed things up, they would break the condemned person's legs with iron clubs. Without legs to push up with, death from asphyxiation came quickly. And this all happened in public. Crucifixions were deliberately conducted in the most visible locations possible. Major roads, city gates, anywhere crowds would see. After the slave rebellion led by Spartacus in 71 BC, the Romans crucified 6,000 of his followers. They lined the Appian Way, the major road from Rome to Capua, with crosses. 6,000 bodies hanging along 130 miles of road. The message was unmistakable. Rebel, and this is your fate. When Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, mass crucifixions were performed to crush any remaining dissent. Hundreds, maybe thousands, executed in the most public way imaginable. The Romans used crucifixion deliberately. It wasn't just about killing people. It was about control, about fear, about making sure everyone knew exactly what happened if you challenged Rome's authority. But crucifixion, as horrific as it was, wasn't even the most bizarre Roman punishment. That distinction goes to something called the poena cullei, the punishment of the sack. This penalty was reserved for one specific crime: parricide, killing your parent or another close blood relative. To the Romans, this was the worst possible crime, worse than treason, worse than murder of strangers. It was an unnatural act that violated the sacred bond of family, and so they created an unnatural punishment to match. If you were convicted of parricide, you would be bound and placed inside a leather sack, but you wouldn't be alone. According to the law, 4 living creatures would be sewn into the sack with you: a dog, a rooster, a monkey, and a venomous snake. Then the sack would be sealed and thrown into a body of water, the Tiber River in Rome. The sea if you were executed near the coast, whatever deep water was available. Inside the sack, in total darkness, you would thrash and struggle. The animals would panic. The dog might bite. The rooster would claw and peck. The monkey would fight for air just like you. The snake, terrified and angry, would strike at anything that moved. If the animals didn't kill you first, you'd drown. All of this happening in complete darkness, in a confined space with no way out. The symbolism was important to the Romans. Each animal represented something. The dog symbolized the violation of loyalty. The rooster represented the disruption of natural order. The monkey mocked human intelligence used for evil. The snake represented the poison of the betrayal. The sack itself symbolized the womb, and throwing it into water represented a reversal of birth. The parricide was being unmade, erased from existence, sent back into the chaos from which they came. Now, historians debate whether this punishment was actually carried out often. It's complicated to execute. You need to capture and contain these specific animals. You need to sew a strong enough sack. You need to do all this while the condemned person and the animals are thrashing around. Some scholars think it was more of a legal concept than a regular practice. A punishment so horrible that even describing it would deter people from the crime. But we know it happened, at least sometimes. The Emperor Claudius authorized the poena cullei more than any other Roman emperor. It's mentioned in multiple historical sources as an actual event, not just a legal theory. Whether it happened frequently or rarely, the fact that the Romans created such a specific, symbolic, theatrical punishment tells us something important about how they thought. Crime wasn't just about breaking rules, it was about disrupting cosmic order, and punishment had to restore that order through symbolic acts. Another uniquely Roman form of suffering was called damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts. And yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. People would be killed by wild animals as public entertainment. This happened during the midday break at gladiatorial games. The morning featured animal hunts and exotic beast displays. The afternoon had the main event, gladiators fighting gladiators. But at midday, during lunch, there was a special show, executions. The condemned would be brought into the arena. Sometimes they were tied to posts. Sometimes they were released to run around the arena while animals chased them. Sometimes they were dressed in costumes to reenact mythological scenes where characters were killed by beasts. The animals varied. Lions were popular, leopards, bears, bulls, sometimes more exotic animals if the games were particularly grand. Elephants, crocodiles. The condemned were usually defenseless. No weapons, no armor, just a person and a very hungry, very angry predator. This was considered one of the most shameful ways to die. It was reserved for the lowest members of society. Slaves, disgraced soldiers, Christians in particular were frequently executed this way during periods of persecution. And thousands of people would watch, would cheer, would eat their lunch while humans were torn apart by animals mere feet away. From our modern perspective, this seems incomprehensible. How could people watch this while eating? How could they bring their families to see it? But to the Romans, this was justice. These were criminals getting what they deserved. It was educational. It reinforced social order. It showed what happened when you violated Roman law. And it was entertainment. The Romans didn't see a contradiction there. Suffering could be both a moral lesson and an enjoyable spectacle. If you were fortunate enough to survive being thrown to the beasts, if somehow the animals didn't kill you, you weren't saved. You were just kept for the next fight. Or your throat was cut. Mercy was almost unknown. Grace was so rare that historians specifically note the handful of cases where someone was spared. Another brutal Roman practice was damnatio ad metallum, condemnation to the mines. This was technically a punishment short of death, but many would have preferred execution. If you were sentenced to the mines, you would be shackled and sent to work in Roman mining operations across the empire. Britain, Spain, North Africa. Wherever Rome needed ore and stone extracted from the earth, the conditions were deliberately horrific. You worked underground in darkness, breathing air thick with dust and toxic fumes. Cave-ins were common, injuries constant, medical care non-existent. You were shackled to prevent escape. You worked long hours every day. The food was minimal, just enough to keep you alive and working. Your life expectancy was measured in months, maybe a couple years if you were very strong and very lucky. Many considered this worse than execution. At least execution ended your suffering. The mines meant years of agony, before eventual death from disease, injury, or exhaustion. This punishment was used for serious criminals, for prisoners of war, for anyone Rome wanted to work to death while also serving an economic purpose. Why simply kill someone when you could extract labour from them first? And then there were punishments specifically for soldiers. The Roman military was incredibly disciplined, and discipline meant harsh penalties for infractions. One military punishment was called fustuarium, clubbing to death. This was the penalty for cowardice in battle. If a soldier fled from combat, or fell asleep on watch, or showed cowardice, he could be sentenced to fustuarium. His fellow soldiers would beat him to death with clubs and stones. Often his own unit would be forced to carry out the punishment. This served multiple purposes. It punished the offender, it forced the other soldiers to participate, binding them together through shared guilt. And it made crystal clear that cowardice would not be tolerated. The Emperor Aurelian, who ruled in the 3rd century AD, created an even more brutal punishment for soldiers who committed adultery with other men's wives. The soldier would be tied upside down by his feet to 2 young tree branches. The branches would be bent down and bound together, creating incredible tension. Then the rope holding the branches would be cut. The trees would spring apart with tremendous force. The soldier would be torn in half. This method was called dismemberment by trees, and it was so violent, so shocking, that even describing it was meant to deter the crime. The rebel leader Procopius was executed this way in 366 AD. Historians recorded it specifically because of how unusual and brutal the method was. Even in an empire accustomed to public crucifixions and gladiatorial slaughter, some punishments stood out as exceptional in their cruelty. So why did the Romans do this? Why such elaborate, theatrical, cruel punishments? Part of it was practical. In an empire as large as Rome, with limited communication technology, you needed dramatic examples to maintain control. A crucifixion, visible from a major road, sent a message to thousands of travellers. Mass executions after rebellions were warnings that lasted generations. Part of it was social. Rome was deeply hierarchical. The way you were punished reflected your status. Citizens got relatively quick deaths. Non-citizens got spectacle. The punishment reinforced who had value and who didn't. Part of it was religious and philosophical. The Romans believed that crimes disrupted cosmic order. Punishments had to be proportional and symbolic to restore that order. The poena cullei, with its specific animals and symbolism, wasn't just cruel. It was a ritual designed to undo the spiritual damage of parricide. And part of it was simply cultural. The Romans didn't have the same views about suffering that modern people do. They saw public execution as entertainment and education combined. They didn't think it was wrong to enjoy watching someone die if that person deserved it. This is the uncomfortable part of Roman history that doesn't make it into most textbooks. We celebrate Roman engineering, their roads and aqueducts. We study Roman philosophy and law. We admire their art and literature. But all of that existed alongside a system of punishment that treated human suffering as both deterrent and entertainment. The same civilization that gave us Stoic philosophy and magnificent architecture also gave us the cross and the amphitheatre execution. The Roman Empire officially ended the practice of crucifixion in 337 AD, when Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. But many other brutal punishments continued for decades or even centuries after. The legacy is complicated. Roman law influenced legal systems across Europe and beyond. Many of our concepts about justice, about proportional punishment, about the rights of citizens versus non-citizens, trace back to Rome. But the specific methods, the theatrical cruelty, the public spectacle of suffering, these eventually faded as cultural values shifted. What seemed normal and even necessary to the Romans came to seem barbaric to later generations. And that raises an uncomfortable question. What are we doing now that people 500 years from now will look back on with the same horror we feel reading about Roman punishments? Every age thinks it's more civilized than the last. Every culture believes its violence is justified while other cultures' violence is barbaric. The Romans certainly believed they were more civilized than the barbarians they conquered, even while they were nailing thousands of people to crosses. So what blind spots do we have? What practices do we accept as normal that future generations will find incomprehensible? The Romans had their reasons for everything they did. Practical reasons, social reasons, religious reasons. They weren't monsters. They were people operating within their cultural framework, doing what made sense to them. And yet, from our perspective, what they did seems monstrous. That gap between their justifications and our judgment is worth thinking about. Because history isn't just about the past, it's a mirror that shows us ourselves. And sometimes what we see reflected back is uncomfortable. Topic 2. Ancient beauty gone wrong. The price of perfection. Now let's shift from violence inflicted on others to violence inflicted on oneself. Because while the Romans were perfecting public executions, civilizations around the world were perfecting something equally dark. The art of poisoning yourself in the pursuit of beauty. Picture yourself in ancient Rome again. You're a wealthy woman of high status. You have access to the finest goods from across the empire. You can afford the most expensive cosmetics, the most exotic beauty treatments. What do you buy? Vials of fresh gladiator sweat, scraped off the skin of fighters after combat. Why? Because you're going to rub it on your face as a cream. You believe it will improve your complexion, maybe even work as an aphrodisiac. Yes, this really happened. Wealthy Roman women purchased gladiator sweat and used it as a beauty product. The sweat of men who had just been fighting, bleeding, rolling in sand and dirt was collected, bottled, and sold as a premium cosmetic. This sounds disgusting to us, but to those women, it made perfect sense. Gladiators were the peak of masculinity and physical power. Surely, something of that vigour could transfer through their sweat. This is just the beginning. The lengths ancient people went to achieve beauty standards were sometimes dangerous, sometimes ridiculous, and frequently both. Let's start with perhaps the most deadly beauty practice in history, the use of white lead as makeup. For thousands of years across multiple continents, pale skin was the ultimate beauty standard. In Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East, lightness of skin indicated wealth and status. It meant you didn't work outdoors. It meant you were aristocratic, refined, above manual labour. And the best way to achieve extremely pale skin: white lead, also called ceruse, a paste made from lead carbonate mixed with vinegar. Ancient Greeks used it. Romans used it. It was wildly popular in Renaissance and Elizabethan England. Chinese and Japanese women used lead-based cosmetics. For literally thousands of years, people all over the world were painting poison onto their faces. White lead makeup created an absolutely perfect pale complexion. It covered everything: blemishes, scars, age spots, discoloration, all hidden under smooth white porcelain skin. It made you look like a perfect statue. Unfortunately, it also slowly killed you. Lead is a cumulative poison. It doesn't leave your body. Every application of white lead makeup added more lead to your system. The lead would be absorbed through your skin. It would accumulate in your bones, your organs, your brain. The symptoms of lead poisoning are awful: hair loss, cognitive problems, memory issues, muscle weakness, digestive problems, kidney and liver damage, neurological disorders, and eventually death. But here's the truly dark part. As the lead poisoning progressed and damaged your skin, making it grey and aged, you would apply more makeup to cover the damage, which would cause more damage, which would require more makeup. A death spiral with your own face. Queen Elizabeth I of England is one of the most famous victims of white lead cosmetics. She used it extensively to cover smallpox scars from her youth. Contemporary accounts describe her makeup as so thick it would crack during conversation, requiring constant touch-ups. She would use fans not just as a fashion accessory, but to hide the cracking makeup. And underneath that makeup, her skin was deteriorating, grey, patchy, damaged beyond repair. Elizabeth suffered from the classic symptoms of lead poisoning: memory problems, mood swings, physical weakness in her later years, hair loss which she covered with elaborate wigs. She knew the makeup was dangerous. Everyone knew. Physicians warned about it. But the social pressure to maintain her appearance, to project the image of the ageless virgin queen, was too strong. She kept using it until she died. And she wasn't alone. Thousands of aristocratic women across Europe used white lead cosmetics daily, knowing the risks, unable or unwilling to stop. Some fashion historians estimate the practice killed more people than many diseases of the era. It was a slow epidemic of vanity-driven poisoning that lasted for centuries. The worst part? Alternatives existed. Chalk powder could lighten the skin without the poison. Rice powder in Asia achieved pale complexions safely, but white lead worked better. It was smoother, more opaque, more effective, so people chose the deadly option over the safe one. White lead wasn't the only poison people voluntarily consumed for beauty. Let's talk about arsenic. In Victorian England, among upper-class women, there was a product called arsenic complexion wafers. These were literally arsenic in edible form. You would eat them, and supposedly they would give you a perfect, pale, translucent complexion from the inside out. Arsenic is one of the most toxic substances known to humans. Even small doses are deadly. But these women ate it anyway. Why would anyone do this? Because it worked, sort of. Arsenic in very small doses can make your skin look pale and smooth. It can make your eyes look larger and more luminous. There's a reason it was called inheritance powder. Many people were poisoned with arsenic for financial gain, precisely because small doses could go unnoticed. But those same small doses cause chronic poisoning, fatigue, digestive problems, organ damage, cognitive decline, and eventually, death. The Victorian era had a dark obsession with consumption, the disease we now call tuberculosis. Consumptive women, slowly dying of TB, had a particular look. Pale skin, flushed cheeks, bright eyes, a fragile, delicate appearance. This became the beauty ideal. Women wanted to look consumptive. They wanted to achieve the appearance of a disease that killed millions. Some women deliberately exposed themselves to tuberculosis, hoping to contract a mild case that would give them the right look. Think about that. People trying to get sick on purpose because the symptoms matched beauty standards. Those who couldn't or wouldn't contract actual tuberculosis would fake it with cosmetics. But they took it further. Arsenic wafers would give them that pale, fragile look. Bloodletting, the practice of deliberately draining blood from your body, would create pallor. Belladonna drops in the eyes would dilate pupils, making eyes look larger and more dramatic. Belladonna, by the way, is Italian for beautiful woman. The plant is also called deadly nightshade. And yes, it's highly toxic. When placed in the eyes, belladonna drops cause extreme pupil dilation. This was considered attractive, making eyes look bigger and more striking. It also causes blurred vision, light sensitivity, and with repeated use, permanent eye damage, including potential blindness. Fashionable Italian women during the Renaissance would use belladonna drops before social events. They would walk around effectively half-blind, unable to see clearly, light hurting their eyes, all so their pupils would look more dramatic. Some historians suggest this is one reason fans became such an important fashion accessory for women. Partly to hide cracked makeup, partly to shield light-sensitive eyes damaged by belladonna, but the truly insane beauty practices go beyond just poison. Let's talk about what people were willing to put on their skin. In ancient Egypt, both Cleopatra and other wealthy women used face masks made from crocodile dung mixed with donkey milk. Yes, crocodile feces, applied to the face. As an anti-aging treatment, ancient Greeks and Romans went even further. They believed in full-body mud baths as a toning treatment. Normal mud baths weren't exotic enough, though, so they used mud mixed with fresh crocodile excrement. Imagine, you're paying premium prices to sit in a bath full of literal crocodile shit. You believe this is making you more beautiful. The ancient Egyptians also used various animal dungs for different beauty purposes. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical texts, lists remedies using donkey dung, dog dung, gazelle dung, and fly dung. All were believed to have healing and beautifying properties. Now, some of these might have actually had minor benefits. Animal dung contains urea, which can act as a mild moisturizer. But the risks, infection, disease, parasites, vastly outweighed any possible benefits. And people knew this was disgusting. They knew they were putting feces on their skin. They did it anyway, because fashion demanded it, and because the alternatives were either ineffective or even more dangerous. Speaking of dangerous alternatives, let's talk about mercury. Mercury was used in cosmetics for centuries. Ancient Persians and Greeks used it. Chinese alchemists prized it. It was a key ingredient in many face creams and beauty potions right up into the early 20th century. Mercury was particularly popular for treating skin conditions and for achieving pale skin. It was mixed into creams and applied directly to the face. The problem, of course, is that mercury is catastrophically toxic. It causes neurological damage, kidney failure, liver damage, tremors, personality changes, psychosis, death. The phrase mad as a hatter comes from mercury poisoning. Hat makers used mercury in their work and frequently suffered neurological damage as a result. They would shake uncontrollably, speak incoherently, and eventually lose their minds. Women were doing the exact same thing to themselves with mercury-based cosmetics, rubbing poison into their skin night after night. The mercury would be absorbed through the skin and accumulate in their bodies. Some physicians recommended mercury treatments for syphilis. The treatment was sometimes effective against the disease, but the mercury poisoning was often worse than the syphilis. There's a grim historical saying, "A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury." But people kept using mercury cosmetics, even when the dangers were known, even when doctors warned against it. The pursuit of beauty overrode safety concerns. Now let's talk about something less toxic, but equally disturbing: the beauty practices that didn't poison you, but did cause permanent physical damage. In ancient Greece, the unibrow was considered incredibly beautiful. A single connected eyebrow symbolized intelligence and purity. Women who didn't naturally have this feature would use dyed goat hair to create a fake unibrow. That's relatively harmless, strange to modern eyes, but not damaging. But then there's foot binding in China. Starting in the 10th century and lasting into the early 20th century, young girls would have their feet deliberately broken and bound to prevent them from growing normally. The process began when girls were between 4 and 7 years old. All the toes except the big toe would be broken and folded under the foot. Then the foot would be wrapped tightly in binding cloth. As the girl grew, her feet would not. They would remain tiny, deformed, crippled. Women with bound feet couldn't walk normally. They were in constant pain. They were at high risk for infection and gangrene. Many became permanently crippled. But small feet were considered beautiful. They were a status symbol. They indicated that a woman didn't need to work, that her family was wealthy enough that she could be decorative rather than productive. This practice was so widespread that millions of women underwent it. For 1,000 years, generations of Chinese women were deliberately crippled in childhood in the name of beauty. When you couldn't walk, you couldn't work. You couldn't leave easily. You were dependent on others. Foot binding was as much about control as it was about beauty. It ensured that wealthy women remained within acceptable social boundaries, literally unable to go far from home. But the practice was framed as beautification, not as control. Girls were told they were being made beautiful, marriageable, valuable. The pain was necessary. The crippling was desirable. Back in Europe, there were other forms of body modification in pursuit of beauty. Tight-lacing corsets could cause rib deformations, organ displacement, breathing problems, and fainting. Women would have ribs surgically removed to achieve smaller waists. The Victorian era also saw the use of tapeworm pills for weight loss. You would deliberately ingest a parasite that would grow inside you, consuming part of your food intake, so you could eat whatever you wanted and stay thin. The side effects included malnutrition, intestinal blockages, organ damage, and the psychological horror of having a parasite growing inside you. But it was sold as a beauty treatment. As diet pills, all these practices have something in common. They involve accepting harm, sometimes extreme harm, in pursuit of an aesthetic ideal. People knew many of these practices were dangerous, but social pressure, cultural ideals, and the promise of beauty made them do it anyway. The aristocratic women using white lead knew it was damaging their skin. They could see the effects, but the alternative, appearing in public without makeup, showing blemishes or aging, was socially unacceptable, so they kept poisoning themselves. Victorian women eating arsenic wafers knew they were consuming poison. It said so on the packaging, but the promise of pale, translucent skin was worth the risk. Chinese families breaking their daughters' feet knew they were crippling them. But unmarriageable daughters were worse than crippled daughters in their cultural context. Modern people look at these practices with horror. How could anyone be so foolish? How could beauty be worth that much suffering? But every era has its blind spots. Right now, people inject botulinum toxin into their faces. It's literally one of the most deadly toxins known to science. But we call it Botox, and it's a standard cosmetic procedure. People undergo painful plastic surgeries with weeks of recovery time. They risk infection, scarring, anesthesia complications, all for aesthetic changes. People engage in extreme dieting that can cause eating disorders. They use tanning beds that dramatically increase cancer risk. They get cosmetic procedures with complication rates that would have been unacceptable in any other medical context. The specifics change. The willingness to accept harm for beauty remains constant. What makes ancient beauty practices particularly dark isn't just the danger, it's the social pressure that made the danger feel necessary. Women who refused white lead makeup in Elizabethan England would be seen as unfashionable, unmarriageable, socially unacceptable. The pressure to poison yourself was immense. Chinese girls whose families refused foot binding would have limited marriage prospects. The practice was cruel, but refusing it could doom a girl to a worse social fate. Victorian women who didn't maintain the proper pale, fragile appearance wouldn't fit beauty standards. In a society where a woman's marriage prospects determined her entire future, beauty wasn't vanity. It was economic survival. This is the darkness underneath ancient beauty rituals. It wasn't stupidity. It wasn't simple vanity. It was systemic pressure that made harmful practices feel not just acceptable, but necessary. And the really uncomfortable truth, we haven't fully escaped this. The specifics have changed. We don't use white lead anymore. But we're still accepting harm in pursuit of beauty. We're still facing immense social pressure to meet aesthetic standards. We just tell ourselves we're different, we're more informed, we're making choices. But so were they. Every generation thinks it's more rational than the last. Every era believes its beauty practices make sense while previous generations were obviously foolish. Meanwhile, we're still injecting toxins into our faces, still undergoing risky surgeries, still engaging in behaviours we know are harmful because the social pressure to be beautiful remains overwhelming. The ancient world shows us in stark terms what we're capable of doing to ourselves. They used lead and arsenic and animal dung. We use different chemicals and procedures, but the underlying dynamic, accepting harm for the promise of beauty, that hasn't changed as much as we'd like to think. Maybe the real lesson from history's bizarre beauty practices isn't that ancient people were foolish. Maybe it's that humans, in every era, are willing to harm themselves for social acceptance. The methods change, the desperation doesn't, and that's a dark truth worth thinking about as you wash your face tonight. Conclusion. 2 stories tonight. 2 different kinds of darkness. The Romans show us what humans are capable of doing to each other. The elaborate cruelty, the theatrical suffering, the way civilization and barbarism can coexist. They built magnificent aqueducts and nailed thousands to crosses. They created philosophy and public executions as entertainment. They were us, and they were capable of horrors. The ancient beauty rituals show us what humans are capable of doing to themselves. The slow poisoning, the deliberate harm, the way social pressure can make suffering feel necessary. They knew lead was dangerous and used it anyway. They knew arsenic was deadly and ate it anyway. They were us, and they were capable of accepting horrors. Both stories ask uncomfortable questions about progress, about whether we're really so different from our ancestors, about what future generations will think of our practices, our justifications, our blind spots. The Romans had reasons for everything. So did the women rubbing crocodile dung on their faces. And we have reasons for everything we do too. But reasons aren't the same as wisdom. Maybe that's the real value of studying history's darkest and strangest chapters. Not to feel superior, not to congratulate ourselves on being more enlightened, but to develop humility, to recognize that every era has its madnesses, and we probably won't see our own clearly until long after. If tonight's journey through history's strange corners made you think, made you uncomfortable, made you question, then it did its job. History isn't just about facts and dates, it's about understanding the humans who came before us, and through them, understanding ourselves. Thank you for listening to this Strange Friday exploration. I'll be back tomorrow with another journey into the hidden, the dark, and the fascinating corners of our past. Until then, remember, history is always stranger and darker than you think, and often it's closer to home than you'd like to believe. This has been Soft Spoken Mysteries